I recently picked up a seriously beat up Super Nintendo, thinking it would make for a fun little restoration project. But when it arrived and I unboxed it, wow, that's not what you want to hear. The case was wrecked. It was obvious someone had already tried and failed to take it apart, because one of the screws was stripped out, so I couldn't even get the two halves of the shell to separate. Now, I do have tools for dealing with stripped screws, but they involve drilling into the screw head, and I wasn't too keen on going that route because I didn't want to risk damaging the electronics. After struggling with it for a bit, I finally decided that since the case was already trashed, the best option was to cut the post and split the two halves, and that finally gave me access to the circuit board. Once I had it out, it was time to see if I could actually get this thing working again. When I powered it up, all I got was a black screen, but the red light did turn on. This looked promising. My gut told me the cartridge slot was probably just dirty. I could see visible corrosion on the pins, so that's where I started. I spent a good 45 minutes cleaning it. Honestly, this kind of stuff is just a persistence game. Clean it, test it, doesn't work, clean it again. I used a bit of rubbing alcohol and deoxit, which is one of my favorite tools for dirty pins and cartridge slots. This stuff is amazing. It definitely took some time and patience, but eventually, after enough cleaning, my efforts paid off. Now that the board was working, I moved on to cleaning the rest. I desoldered the power connector and removed the rear I/O cover so I could properly clean the board underneath, which unfortunately did lead to some problems, as you'll see later on. After cleaning everything, I reassembled it and soldered the power connector back on. Then I slipped the whole thing into a new translucent case I'd purchased. I decided to do a quick test, and it didn't work. My first guess was that the case didn't fit perfectly. The sound module posts were a little too tall, so it seemed like the board wasn't sitting right. I tried shaving down the posts to help it fit better, but even after that, it still didn't work. So I pulled the board out, tested it again, and it worked fine outside the case. Thoroughly confused at this point, I started putting it back in screw by screw, testing as I went. And here's the kicker. When I tightened the screw near the power connector and rear I/O plate, the console stopped working again. Turns out, when I resoldered the power connector, it wasn't fully seated on the motherboard. Tightening that screw actually ripped the solder pads off the board, basically breaking the connection. To fix it, I added a bit more solder and reflowed the joint, and luckily that brought it back to life. But that wasn't the end of it. The power connector itself was cracked, and when I wiggled the power plug, it caused a short. After all this, I tested the power supply and it was outputting 18 volts. I was sending double the rated voltage right into the console. Way too high. At this point, I thought I'd destroyed it for good. Panic set in, but I grabbed a multimeter and started testing everything I could. Luckily, I found a blown 1.5 amp fuse, which thankfully saved the console from permanent damage. I grabbed some tweezers, used a working power supply from a different SNES, and carefully bridged the fuse to get the console powered back on. The red light came on. Fingers crossed, it still worked. I quickly ordered replacement fuses from Amazon. Fast forward a day or two, the fuses arrived, and I got to work soldering one in. This whole mess was caused by a broken barrel connector on the back of the console. So I ordered a replacement off eBay and waited a few more days. When it arrived, I cleaned up the contacts as best I could, trying not to cause more damage, and then carefully slid the new power port into place. This part was nerve-wracking because you have to lift the RF connector, which feels like you're bending the motherboard. It's one of those moments where you're worried you might break your console for good. After some delicate maneuvering, I finally got it seated properly. This time, I made sure it was fully in place before soldering it down. The solder pads on the bottom were destroyed, so I had to solder one of the terminals to the top of the motherboard. Once everything was patched up, I reassembled just enough of the console to test it, and I was so relieved to hear the F-Zero music start up. Despite my best efforts, this thing still works great. I also picked up a triad power supply recommended by Retro RGB. Huge shout out to him for the tip, because finding a reliable power supply is actually way harder than you'd think. I also wanted to add something unique. Recently, I discovered this thing called electroluminescent wire, and I thought, why not make the console light up when you turn it on? So that's exactly what I started working on. The EL wire I bought runs off 2 AA batteries, so about 3 volts. I grabbed my multimeter and started poking around inside the console to see where I might be able to tap into that voltage. At first, I found a pin on the external accessory port that had about 2.7 volts. Close enough, I thought, but after testing, that idea quickly flopped. The EL wire pulled the voltage down to 0 almost immediately. Not enough current, not reliable, not safe. So, scratch that. So instead, I use a device called a buck converter. So I soldered one wire just past the power switch, another directly to the ground connector, then routed those through the buck converter and finally into the EL wire's power supply. Flipped the switch, pressed the EL power button, and boom, it lit up. Progress. But I still needed to make the EL wire turn on automatically. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about electronics. My strategy here was try stuff. First, I tried shorting the momentary switch. It turned on just fine, so I tried to lift a pin, planning to bypass it, and in the process, I accidentally broke the chip. At that point, I just bridged the solder pads. Not ideal, definitely not recommended. Please don't follow my lead here unless you enjoy rolling the dice with electrical fires. Luckily though, it worked. I checked to see if it was drawing excessive current, but everything was as expected. The EL wire now powered on as soon as the console did, and the Super Nintendo still ran games like nothing had changed. With the power sorted, it was time to actually mount the wire to the console. Originally, I wanted to outline the edges of the case, but the design made that basically impossible. Eventually, I found a better solution. Instead of running the wire flush along the case, I used the internal tabs to suspend the EL wire like little power lines. It looked cleaner and kept most of the glue hidden. I glued everything in place, trimmed the excess wire, reassembled the case, and the project was finally complete. And here it is, my Restomod Super Nintendo. The whole process took way more time and effort than I expected, with a lot of mistakes and frustration along the way. But honestly, it was worth it. Not just because I got the console working again, but because the Super Nintendo isn't just some old piece of tech. It was a part of my childhood. There's something really special about sitting down with my kids to play the same games I grew up with, and watching their faces light up the way mine did decades ago. It reminded me why I loved this stuff in the first place. I'll probably keep tinkering, keep learning, and who knows, maybe tackle something even more ambitious next time. If that's something you're into, consider subscribing so you don't miss it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and of course, thanks for watching.